This is a Made Label sew along for the Sierra Belle wrap dress. You can purchase the pattern at the link on the screen, and if you need any help assembling it, check out our /assemble link. To make this pattern, you will need a woven or non-stretch material. We recommend rayon or viscose or something with a similar weight and drape. Always pre-wash and iron your fabric before you start cutting, and then you can avoid any kind of shrinkage that is going to happen. To choose your size, check out the size chart in your pattern information and focus on the bust measurement and shoulder to shoulder measurement. The more ease that you add in the Sierra Belle, the more of a relaxed fit that you will create. If you have something that has less ease, it's going to create a slightly more fitted dress. It just depends on what kind of fit you're after. So to select your size, you just want to take your body measurement and then you want to add in the minimum amount of ease where necessary. And you can see in the finished measurement chart that where you need to add ease, it will tell you the minimum amount of ease that you need to add to get the right fit for the garment. Then you take those two measurements added together to find what size that you need to make. We give back with every pattern, and you can check that out at madelabel.co/giving back. All of the cutting plans and information on how much bias to cut and how long different lengths of bias will need to be for this project will all be in your pattern information document. So definitely check that out and give it a read before jumping in. An important note is that you need to cut the Belle skirt along the cut at the Sierra Belle line, and if you are making this from an existing Belle skirt or another mix and match dress, make sure you're cutting along the skirt line on the Belle skirt pattern pieces. As the Sierra top sits a little lower on the natural waistline, this will ensure that it hugs your body in all the right places. So we're going to start with how to cut the different pattern types, starting with place on fold. Line up the place on fold line with the folded edge of your material. Now you want to make sure that that folded edge is an equal distance away from the salvage edge to make sure that your pattern cuts straight. Lining up that place on fold edge with the folded edge of the fabric, make sure that it is perfectly in line, not to make it bigger or smaller than the pattern. You want to weigh down your pattern with fabric weights, and then you're going to cut all the way around the pattern except for the fold line. If you are cutting a fabric that's a little slippy, such as a rayon, we do suggest using a rotary cutter rather than scissors, as it makes the cutting out a lot more accurate and a lot easier too. And once you've cut the whole way around, once you open up your pattern, you're going to have two symmetrical sides of the pattern piece, and that's a place on fold. Next, we're going to do mirror cut. So you can either cut mirror cut on a folded piece of fabric or one at a time, but you need to make sure that you are going to flip your pattern if you're cutting on a single sheet of fabric. When you cut mirror cut pattern pieces, you want to end up with mirrored versions of the same pattern piece, so a pair that fits both the left and right. So you're going to line up your grain line with the salvage edge and then weigh down your pattern piece. And you want to cut all the way around the pattern piece. Make sure that you're getting all of your notches that are on any pattern piece. And for this particular sleeve, you're just going to do tiny little slits for the reverse box pleats. If you are cutting it out on a folded piece of fabric, you will be cutting the pair both at the same time. However, if you're cutting them singly one at a time, which can be easier if you're just new to cutting out pattern pieces, you need to cut out two, making sure to flip your pattern. So either way, once you finish cutting your mirror cut pattern pieces, you should end up with mirrored versions of the same pattern piece, which will give you a left and a right. To start off the construction, we're going to be sewing up the bust darts. The first step is to mark the point of your pattern with something like an awl, or you can use a pin if you don't have a sewing awl, at each point of the bust dart. This is going to help you mark the points of the bust dart that you need to draw in with a iron off pen. Once you've marked in all your dart points, you want to line up your grain line with the selfage edge, and you're going to cut out the top pattern piece. Now we suggest doing this one at a time with your wrong side of your fabric facing up, as this is going to make it a lot easier to mark your points. So once you've cut everything out, you want to use those marks that we've made to mark the points on your fabric. And you can see when the wrong side's facing up, it's a little easier to see. Mark in each point that you marked with the awl, as well as the top points of the bust dart, and then you want to join these up. Make sure that your lines are straight and accurate, as you will be using these as sewing guides. You want to mark each of the side legs, and then you also want to mark the center point of the dart. Remembering that once you've completed one side of the top, you'll need to repeat the process on the other side of the top. You then want to pinch the center line and fold the fabric right sides together. And then you're going to pin along the dart leg with lengthways pins to make sure that you are getting both sides of the leg in the exact same position, and the center line of the dart should be along the fold. Your lengthways pins the whole way along the dart are going to make sure that you are pinning the dart legs together exactly, and you want to be checking both sides of your fabric. A little pinning hack is, once you have these lengthways pins in the right position, you can put crosswise pins that are going to be easy to sew over at the machine. Once you have your lengthways pins in, you can put crosswise pins in and remove the lengthwise pins that are going to be easy to sew at the machine. And once you've removed those lengthways pins, you're going to sew one line of stitching along the dart leg, starting at the end of the dart and working towards the center of the dart. Sew right off the edge and pull long threads to finish. You should end up with a line of stitching along that dart leg, and then you want to tie off the point of the dart with a few knots to make sure that it doesn't come undone later. If you didn't backstitch at the top of the dart, you can also use this same method to tie off the dart to make sure that the stitching doesn't unravel while you are working on your project. Next, we're going to get to pressing. So the first thing you want to do is press your dart flat, making sure that you don't press anywhere near the point of the dart. Next, you want to press your dart towards the bottom of the top. Ideally, you're going to have a tailor's hand for this, but a hack you can use is to lift the fabric as you press it towards the point. And once you're at the point, only use steam. This is going to give you a very beautifully finished dart that doesn't have a pointed edge on it. Next, we're going to add a line of stay stitching along the neckline. This is just a single line of stitching that stops the neckline from warping while you're working on the project. It should be as close to the edge as you feel comfortable sewing, and you can give it a quick press once you've finished. Next, we're going to be jumping into assembling the top, and we're going to start with sewing the side ties into the side seams. So we're going to start by cutting 2 lengths of bias that are going to be your side ties. Now, to find how long to cut these ties, as well as how much bias you're going to need for this project for the facing of the neckline and the other ties, you want to check your written instructions or your pattern information. You're also going to find on your cutting plan for your size in the pattern information document how big to cut your bias square measurement. You're then going to cut diagonal strips of this bias square 3.5 centimeters or 1 1/3 inches wide the whole way along the square to create your lengths of bias. Now, if you haven't made bias before out of material to match your garment, you can check out our short tutorial on the screen and also linked below. So once you cut your bias lengths for the ties, you want to close them off at one end for a clean finish. So you want to open them up and then fold the edges back in like a little present and press. And then you're going to fold it in half again, so it is like double folded bias. And then you're going to just poke any raw edges out and pin in place. And you want to do the same on both ties. You're then going to run a line of stitching along the open side of the ties to close them off, making sure that you backstitch at the end and sew off the corner. You should be stitching as close to the open edge of the bias as you feel comfortable, just taking it nice and slow. And once you finish, you will need to give it a press, as you will find that they may go a little bit curvy from sewing them. And your ties will now be ready to sew into the side of your top. Now we're going to be sewing the side seams with French seams. You can of course use regular seams with 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters if you prefer. We're going to be joining the shoulder seams and the side seams using French seams. So this is where we're going to add our first tie into the side seam, which will be the inside tie of the wrap top. So you want to measure up 17 millimeters or about 3/4 of an inch from the bottom of the bodice. It doesn't matter which side you choose to do this on, but it will affect the way that the wrap dress ties. This is going to be the inside tie of the bodice or wrap dress. You then want to place the edge where you've sewn along on the top of the mark and pin that in place with just a little bit of overhang over the edge of the side seam bodice. And once you're happy, you can pin that in place. You're going to then sandwich the tie and pin the rest of the side seams with wrong sides together, and you're going to finish that with your first pass at the French seam. But before we do that, you want to pin your shoulder seams and the other side seams with wrong sides together and the notches lining up. Once you have everything pinned in place, we're going to sew the first pass at the French seam, which is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter away from the raw edges. You want to do this along all the pinned seams. When you're sewing over the tie, you can also do a back stitch just to reinforce for structure. Then you want to press the seams to set the stitches in place. Once pressed, you can cut the raw edge back to less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter, but be sure not to nip the stitches. You then want to open up your French seam and you're going to press the seam flat. Flip your fabric so the right sides are then together, and you want to press that sewn seam to the outside edge. And on the side with the tie, you should see that that just flips out to the inside of the bodice. To finish the French seam, you would do another line of stitching 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter away from the folded seam. And you're going to follow the exact same process of creating the French seams for all the other sewn seams. Now, before we head back to the machine and do the final pass, we want to add in the outside tie. This is going to be sewn into the final pass of the French seam on the other side of the bodice. So as we did on the other side, you want to mark up 17 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch from the bottom of the bodice. You then want to place your raw edge of your tie hard up against the inside seam, lining up the bottom sewn edge with the top of the mark. This tie is going to be on the outside edge, so should be on the right side of your fabric. And once you get that in the right place, you want to pin that in place, and then you're going to flip that French seam in so it sandwiches the tie. Make sure you pin the tie securely so it doesn't move when you're sewing, and you can pin the rest of the French seam as well. You're then going to finish this French seam with 1/4 of an inch or a 1/2 centimeter seam. You want to sew this final pass of the French seam along all your pinned seams. Also, when you get to sewing across your tie, make sure that it's sitting straight in your top, and you can also backstitch across the tie area to reinforce it. And once you've completed your French seams, you can give them a final press, and you should see that your tie is now on the outside of your bodice. And you want to press all of these seams forward, making sure that you give them a very good steam. And you should now have the main part of your bodice complete, with one tie on the outside and one tie on the inside. We're now going to move on to assembling the sleeve. So first we're going to add bias facing to the cutout. Because this cutout is quite small, we're going to use a slimmer piece of bias to create the facing. You just need enough to go around the inside of the whole cutout. So usually our strips of bias are 3.5 centimeters or 1 1/3 inches wide. But for this particular one, we're going to do 3 centimeters wide or 1 3/16 inches wide. So just as you did with your regular bias, you want to put it through the bias binding maker. You will find that you can put it through the same bias binding maker as you've used with your 3.5 centimeter strips, as you can always go a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller through the same bias binding tape maker. And you want to press this flat the entire way along the bias strip, and then you're going to come back and fold it in half to have double folded bias tape. Once you have your double folded bias tape, you want to unfold one edge, and right sides together you want to place the raw edges along the cutout of your sleeve. Pin this bias in place along the edge of the cutout with right sides together. This can be a little bit of a fiddly process, and at the top and most curvy part of the cutout, it can help to just pull it straight while you pin the bias in place. Once you have everything pinned, you want to sew along that folded edge along the entire way of the cutout. And it can help to just pull the cutout straight as you're sewing and not try and sew it as a curved cutout. Because it has a very steep curve, to help it sit flat, you want to cut out tiny little triangles along the bias edge. Now you want to snip from the raw edge up to that first line of stitching in tiny little triangles. Make sure not to snip the stitching as you are cutting these out. Next, we're going to fold the bias facing in. So you want to take the folded edge and encasing all those little triangles you've cut out, fold it to the sewn edge. And then you're going to flip everything over and fold it over again so that all of your facing is on the raw side of your fabric, and on the front side, you shouldn't be able to see any facing. You will also find that your sewn edge is on the very edge of this rolled over facing that you are doing. Now this can be a little bit tricky, but just take your time and make sure that you're pinning as you go. And once you have everything pinned in place, you can come back and give that a very good press. This makes it a lot easier to sew the last line of stitching. And you do want to then head to the machine and sew the last line of stitching as close to the edge of the bias facing as possible. It can be easier if you pull the cutout so it's more of a straight line, and if you need to, you can pivot your presser foot to get the direction of the sewing right. Just take your time and do it one stitch at a time. And once you're finished, give it a very good press and you should find that you have a beautiful facing to your cutout. Next, we're going to sew the reverse box pleats. So if you've had a look at your finished measurement chart and feel you want a little bit more room in the opening of the sleeve, you can reduce the front two box pleats to be the same width as the back box pleats. Or alternatively, you can lose the back two box pleats altogether and just have the front two. It's up to you, whatever you think is going to fit you and suit you better. We are going to be following along with the pattern as it is. So you should have groups of 3 little notches, and you want to join up the outside 2 notches, and the middle notch should be right on the inside folds with right sides together. Using the lined up notches as a guide, you want to mark up 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters and draw a line. This is going to be a guide as we're going to sew up each of the box pleats. Pin in place, and then you are going to continue this process on each of the grouping of 3 box pleats. So you should end up with 4 lines that you're going to sew up. And you're going to do the exact same process on the other sleeve. So you're going to have 8 lines in total that you're going to sew up. So for each reverse box pleat, you want to put your presser foot down so the needle is in line with that guide stitch line. You're going to sew up to the end of the guide stitch line and then reverse and sew the entire way back along it. And you're going to do this for each group of reverse box pleats. And you can see once you've finished that you should have these little tiny puckers of material. And what we're going to do is put something thin like your embroidery scissors into the little hole and then press it flat. You then want to get your iron and you're going to press the reverse box pleat flat, pulling it up so it disappears up the top of the sleeve. And that is going to give you a beautifully pressed reverse box pleat. You're going to continue to do this on each set of pleats. If you are keeping the pattern as is, you will find that the pleats closer to the little sleeve cutout are a little bit wider, so you just want to press up until that box pleat starts to disappear. So once you've sewn and pressed all of your pleats together, you will see that your sleeves are coming together beautifully. So the next step in assembling the sleeve is to add 2 lines of basting stitch where we're going to gather the cap of the sleeve. So starting at the first notch, you want to add a basting stitch, which is your longest stitch length between the 2 notches. Should be about 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter from the raw edge, and then you want to come back to that first notch and sew another 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter line of basting from the first line of basting stitch. So you should end up with 2 lines of basting stitch along the cap of the sleeve, starting at the first notch of the basting stitch and going to the second notch of the basting stitch. And we're going to use these to gather in the cap of the sleeve later. Next, we're going to join the side seam of the sleeves using a French seam. So match the side seams with wrong sides together and pin in place. Now, we're not going to take you through all the steps again of the French seam, but you can skip back to earlier in the tutorial if you want to remind yourself on how to sew up the French seam. And here's a quick little reminder of each of the steps. So once you've got your French seam all sewn up, you can press it flat and then press it to one side. Now this can be a little bit tricky, and it helps to pull the material as you are pressing the French seam to one side. And when you flip your sleeve right way in, you'll see that it's really coming together. Next, we're going to add the tie to the end of the sleeve. So to start, you want to get 2 of the cutouts of your ties and place them right sides together, lining up the little notch marks. Now from the notch mark, we're going to be sewing all the way around the outside of the tie, leaving space between the 2 notch marks. So you want to pin starting from one of the notches all the way around the tie. And if you have any uneven ends at the end of your tie, you can just trim them so it's nice and even. So once you've pinned the whole way along the ties, starting from the first notch mark, you want to sew to the end of the tie, pivoting at the edges, and you're going to sew all the way around the end of the tie until you reach the second notch, leaving this middle space open. Your line of stitching should be 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter away from the raw edge of the tie. And you're going to sew all the way around the edges, pivoting at the corners as you need to. And once you've sewn that all up, you should see that you've got a seam 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge, and the space between the notches is left open. Next, you want to give your ties a quick press just to set the stitching in place. Then you want to start from one notch all the way around where the stitch line is and cut back to less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter. Once you reach the notch mark that indicates the start of the open space, you just want to cut diagonally up to it. Next, in the space between the notches, you want to fold that back 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter and press flat. And you want to do this on both sides of the tie. On the second side, you do want to make sure that it is as even as possible to the first pressed back side. Once it's all pressed, you're going to feed in the tie ends through that open space so it's right side in. You can use the end of a blunt pen or a chopstick, whatever long implement you have laying around. And you want to make sure that you use a sharpish kind of object to get those ends of the ties nice and pointed. You then want to roll the seams to the outside of the tie. You can use a little bit of wiggling with your fingers and then come along and press with the iron, making sure that your ends of your tie have nice pointed edges. At the opening of the tie, you want to make sure that everything is lining up perfectly as you wiggle the seam to the outside edge, and I find it's helpful just to pin everything in place just to make sure that it's going to be even on both edges before you press it in place. And once you've completed the pressing, you want to fold your tie in half and mark the halfway point. Make sure you are using an iron-off pen. Then laying your sleeve flat so that there's an equal amount of distance from each side of the cutout. You want to find that halfway point. Now it's going to be a little bit off from the back side seam as the cutout sits slightly forward on your arm. When you have this point, you want to line them up. Then with your tie open, you want to encase the open area of your tie around the raw edge of your sleeve, pinning in place as you go. It is helpful here to use lengthwise pins across the very top of the tie to make sure that it is even on both sides of the sleeve. And if you take your time here, it's going to make sewing it up a lot easier as you're going to make sure that you're capturing both sides of the tie. And you want to continue around the raw edge of the sleeve. You should find that the raw edge of your sleeve is just hitting the inside seam of the tie, and you want to use those lengthways pins as you go, making sure that it's at the top of the front of the tie and the back of the tie. And you should find that that open space about perfectly fits the raw edge of your sleeve, and you want to pin it right up to the edge of that sleeve. And you're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Once you have everything pinned in place, make sure that your ties are even, and then you're going to have a little bit of space just at the end of your opening of your top, and you want to pin that in place, and that's where you're going to start your line of stitching. Now you do want to take a moment here just to make sure that those lengthways pins are really capturing the tie across the whole edge of the raw sleeve. And you can go ahead and replace those then with crossways pins, the same as we did on the dart, so that you don't have to stop and take out pins at the sewing machine. Be sure that you're not using a very delicate fabric, that this is going to create too much damage. And then you can go ahead and take out those lengthways pins so you can just sew straight around the top of the tie at the machine. So starting from the start of either of the ties where the hole is opening, you're going to sew just along the top edge of that tie the whole way along the sleeve. Do make sure that you backstitch at the start and end of the tie, and just take this very nice and slowly. You want to leave just less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter from the top, and once you've finished you can go and make sure that it's captured the tie on both sides of the sleeve. And you want to sew all the way until the point where you have marked the start of the other tie. And doing your final spot check just to make sure that your line of stitching has captured on both sides, you can finish with a quick press, and that is your sleeve really coming together. Next up, we're going to be attaching this sleeve to the bodice. Now this little rectangle marks the back of the sleeve, so that should always be in line with the back of the bodice. We are going to be joining the sleeve with a French seam, and you always just want to make sure that your bottom seam is lining up. So the first thing you want to do once you have your sleeve lined up is turn it inside out, and then you're going to insert the sleeve into the bodice so that the bottom seam is lining up and the back of the sleeve is with the back of the bodice, wrong sides together. So first, lining up the bottom seam, you want to pin that in place, and then you're going to work your way around the top until you reach the start of the double basting at the cap of the sleeve. You're going to pin up to that first notch that marks the start of the basting, and then you're going to go and pin the same on the other side of the sleeve. Just to note, when you do get to the point of pinning the dart down, just make sure that everything is smooth and that your dart is sitting well on the inside of the top as well. And again, you're just going to continue to pin the sleeve together until you reach the mark where the gathering stitches begin. So from here, once you've pinned everything in place up to both gathering stitches, you should find that you have a lot of extra loose material at the cap that we're going to gather in. The next step is to take that middle notch and line it up with the shoulder seam of your top, and you want the little point of the notch just to be in the middle of the seam, and you want to pin that in place. Once you've pinned the top notch to the shoulder seam, then you're going to gather in both sides. Using the top 2 strings from your basting stitches, you just want to gather in the loose material until it sits flat against the bodice. And making sure that all your gathers are even throughout that space, you just want to pin everything in place. And you're going to follow the exact same process on the other side of the sleeve, just gathering in that loose material until it is sitting flat against the bodice opening. You are better to have the gathers more focused towards the cap of the sleeve, as that is going to give you a very cute gather at the very top of the sleeve once everything is sewn in place. Now, as with all French seams, we're going to do a first pass 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter all the way around the sleeve from the raw edge. It's a good idea to make sure that your gathers are facing up as you sew, so you can make sure that everything is sewing nice and straight at the machine. Once you finish that first pass of the French seam, you want to give everything a very good press, including all of the gathers, and evening them out with your fingernails if you need to. And you want to make sure that your seams are all lining up and that your dart is sitting nice and flat before you do the second pass of the French seam, just to make sure there's nothing that you need to fix. We're then going to trim back to less than 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter, and this can be a little bit tricky, so just really take your time and make sure that you're not nipping anything. Once you get to the gathers, it's a good idea to turn it so the bodice is facing up, so you can clearly see the one line of stitching and all of the gather lines of stitching are not in your way. You're then going to open up the seam and press it flat the whole way around. You can use just the very tip of your iron when you're doing this, but do make sure that you're pressing everything flat, as this will make a huge difference to your sleeve sitting well in the end. Once you reach the gathers, again, just use the tip of your iron just to press everything in place and make sure they are all even. And with all French seams, you're going to flip the top so that the right sides are together, and then you want to press that sewn seam to the outside edge the whole way around the sleeve opening. Be quite meticulous when you're pressing, as this is going to make sewing a lot easier, and you can use as many pins as you need to hold everything in place. You also want to make sure that you press the gathers at the cap of the sleeve, and everything should be looking really nice and even. We're then going to finish the French seam with 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter the whole way along the cap. Again, you want to make sure that your gathers are facing up when you're sewing, just so you can make sure that everything is sewing nice and evenly as you do this last stitch. Once you're finished, you want to use the end of your ironing board or a sleeve pressing board and give everything an extremely good press. And that is your bodice complete. I want to start by joining the back panel to the 2 side panels by joining up the little notches on the side seams, and then you want to pin wrong sides together the entire way down both seam lines. On both of the seams, you want to close with French seams. If you need a reminder on how to sew French seams, you can skip back to an earlier part of the video or reference the steps on the screen. And once you've sewn up all your beautiful French seams, you want to press them all forward. So you want to start with the mitered corners, which will be on the corners of the front panel. On both sides leading up to the corner, you want to press 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter. Make sure that it's pressed really well by going over it a couple of times. You then want to come back and roll another 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter and press again. Make sure you're using quite a lot of steam so it is really set in place. Again, making sure that it's set in place, just giving it that extra double steam. Next, you want to open out just one fold of the corner, and you want to mark around 1/3 inch or 7 millimeters away from the center point on both sides. Then, using those marked points, you want to draw a line straight across the corner. From there, you want to fold the corner in half so both of the lines are matching up, and then you want to pin it in place. Make sure that the lines are matching on both sides. You're then going to sew straight across that line at the machine. You can start just on the edge and you want to sew all the way to the front and then also backstitch across the line again just to make sure that it's secure. And you can see you'll have a line of stitching straight across the drawn line, and you can snip the corner off just below that stitch line. Then flip the corner in, and using something like a pen, you can poke it so it's nice and straight, and then you can press your mitered corner. If this is your first time doing a mitered corner, make sure that you flip it in and test it before you give it a snip just to make sure everything's working. And from there, you want to continue to press the double rolled seam, starting with your first pass at 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter the entire way around the outside of the skirt. And then you're going to come back and do the second pass again at 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter. Remember that if you slightly pull the fabric as you roll it, it will make it a lot easier to do the double rolled hem. From there, you're going to sew your hem all the way on the inside edge of that double rolled seam, making sure that you stop and pivot at the corners. Take it nice and slow and use your left hand just to guide the fabric. And when you come to that corner, you want to get on the very edge, keep your needle down and then pivot and slowly take off again to make sure that your material doesn't get caught in the machine. Lastly, you want to give it a really good press. As you want it to hang really straight on the front of the skirt, you want to press down and steam, trying not to pull the fabric in any way, but giving it just an excellent steam the whole way around. So next we're going to be joining the skirt and the bodice. So the first thing you want to do is do a line of basting stitch across the back of the bodice between the two seams, and then 2 lines of basting stitch along both of the front panels of the bodice. Your basting stitch should be the longest stitch length on your machine, and you want to do this around 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter away from the raw edge. Make sure that you pull very long threads at the start and end of all of your basting stitches. And it is very important that you stop at the seam of the bodice to start a new line of basting stitch, as you will only need 1 line of basting stitch on the back of the bodice. And you want these strings separate so that you can gather them in separately. And you'll see that you'll end up with 2 lines of basting stitch on the front panels and 1 line of basting stitch on the back top panel. Next, you want to mark 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter from the end of the top on the front top panel pieces. Once you have your mark, draw a vertical line on the end of the top front panel pieces. Next, you want to mark the halfway and quarter-way points from the side seam of the back top panel and also the front top panel. On the back top panel, using the side seams to match, find your halfway point and you're going to mark that on the wrong side of your fabric. Then use that halfway point to mark out the quarter-way points from the side seams of the back top panel. Make sure that you're using an iron-off pen and you have tested it on your fabric to make sure that it isn't going to leave any stain marks. Once you've made all your marks on your back top panel, then we're going to move on to the front top panels. And you're going to use that mark that you made as the starting point to match to the side seams to find your quarter-way and halfway points, and the same way you're going to mark them on the wrong side of your fabric. And you want to follow this same process, marking the half and quarter-way points on the back skirt panel and the front skirt panels as well. We're going to be joining the skirt and top using a French seam, so you want to line up the quarter-way and halfway points and also the side seams to start with wrong sides together. So starting at the side seam, you want to pin that in place. Then you're going to move on to find both of the halfway points that you've marked on your skirt and bodice, and you want to line those up and again pin them in place. You're then going to move on to match the quarter-way points. The line of basting stitch on the back top panel is added due to the fact that the back top panel is drafted ever so slightly longer than the back skirt panel, and you should find this is enough to make all your quarter-way points line up perfectly. However, if you do find that you still have a little bit too much fabric, you can always use this to pull in or ease the stitches just a little bit to make sure that everything fits. Once you've done one side of the skirt, you can move on to the other side of the skirt, matching the side seam and the quarter-way points and pinning everything in place. And we're then going to be ready to move on to attaching the front skirt panel and the front top panel. Next, you want to line up your halfway point of your skirt and your bodice and pin that in place. We're then going to use the 2 lines of basting stitch that we previously sewed to slightly gather in the loose material on the front top panel so that it sits evenly against the skirt panel. So using those top 2 threads from your gathering stitches, you just want to slowly gather in the material until your quarter-way points match and that the top panel is sitting flat against the skirt panel. Then you just want to pin in place from the side seam all the way to the halfway point, evening out any gathers as you pin everything in place. Next, we're going to move on to the second half of the top. So you want to take again the top 2 strings and slightly gather that top in until it sits flat against the skirt. Now that mark that you made earlier on the top needs to line up with the finished edge of the skirt, and you should have that 5 millimeters or 1/4 inch overhang after the finished hem of the skirt, and you're going to pin those in place wrong sides together. Now it is very important that you do have that little bit of overhang from that marked area on the top, as we're going to use that later for folding over the bias facing. So once you have that pinned in place, again, you just want to even out your gathers to match up the quarter way points. And then once everything is laying flat, you're going to go ahead and pin everything in place. We are going to be joining the skirt and the top with a French seam. So we're going to do the first pass, which is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Now we're not going to walk through all the steps of the French seam, as we've already gone through in this tutorial, and you can skip back and have a reminder if you need a little memory jog. And here is the quick overview of the steps on the screen. A couple of things to note with this French seam is make sure that your bodice is facing up when you're sewing the first pass of the French seam, as this will make it easier to see the gathers. Also, when it comes to trimming, make sure that your skirt is facing up, as the extra line of gathering stitches can make it hard to see exactly where to trim. And when you are doing that last pass on the French seam, make sure that it doesn't catch any of the inside or outside ties. You want it to go just underneath those ties so that they are going to be free once that final pass of the French seam is done. And you can see once we have finished the French seam, we're going to have that 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 of an inch overhang at the top of the bodice where it joins to the skirt. So next you want to gather up that bias that is going to be the neckline bias and create the other ties. And remember, you can find the length for this bias in your pattern instructions or in your pattern information. And you want to close one end of the bias the same as you did on your ties. From there, you want to find the halfway point of your bias length and mark that with your removable pen. Be sure to make the mark very clear so that you don't miss it. It can be helpful to open up the bias and mark both sides. Next, you're going to mark the halfway point on your back top panel, matching up the side seams. And you want to mark that halfway point on the wrong side of your fabric. And once you have your mark on the wrong side, you can also transfer it to the right side as well, just to help when you're lining everything up. Next, we're going to join the halfway point that you marked on your bias binding with the halfway point that you marked on your back top panel. So opening out one side of your double folded bias, you want to line up those two marks, and right sides together, you want to pin the raw edges. And from that halfway point on the back of the top, you're going to pin all the way around the neckline, pinning the raw edges of the bias and the top together. When you reach the side seam, just make sure that your French seam is laying flat the entire way along the seam edge. And you want to continue pinning all the way along the neckline. Once you reach the end of the neckline, you're going to be sewing along this folded line as a guide. And we want that folded line just to capture the very edge of the finished skirt. So to make sure that we're going to be sewing exactly in the right place, you want to use lengthwise pins along that folded edge that you're going to be sewing along. And this is going to allow us to flip back the bias and make sure that we have captured that skirt edge in the perfect place. When you are pinning over the edge of the skirt, you can just fold the bias back to make sure that you're pinning in the correct place. And from there, you can see when you fold back the bias that it should just have captured the edge of the skirt. Once you're happy with your placement, you can come and replace your crosswise pins and remove those lengthways pins, so that's going to make it easy to sew at the machine. And once you're ready, you're going to sew all the way along the neckline on that folded line as a guide. You want to take this nice and slow, and you're going to start at the start of the neckline of the top and sew all the way around the neckline until you reach the end of the top on the other side of the bodice. And you can see once that's sewn in place, you can flip up the bias and make sure that everything is perfectly captured at the point where the bias turns into the tie. So next we want to fold over the bias facing the whole way around the neckline. So the first thing to do is fold your bias down to that sewn line, encasing all those raw edges, and there's no need to trim anything because there's no curves. And then once you've folded it over to that first sew line, you want to fold it over again. So the bias facing is going to be sitting on the inside of the bodice, and that sewn line is going to be sitting right on the edge there. And you want to continue this process of folding in the bias facing to that first sew line and then rolling it in again so that it sits on the wrong side of the top and can't be seen from the front. And this is going to give you an immaculate finish around the neckline of your top. When you reach these seams, just make sure that your French seam is going to be laying flat, but you're going to do exactly the same process of rolling over to the sew line and then tucking everything under again. You will find that as you practice this skill, if it's new to you, that it becomes a little bit easier and actually quite meditative. So to finish off the point at where the facing becomes the tie, you want to follow the same process of rolling it into the sewn line, and you'll see that your tie is actually then folded in half, and then you do want to roll it over again. Once you've pinned this bias facing in place, you should find that it captures all of the raw edges at the edge of the skirt, and you're left with a very clean transition from where the tie starts and the bias facing begins. And you can see that once we've sewn all the bias facing in place, we will just go back and sew the tie closed that will be at the top of the tie. So before we head back to the sewing machine, it's really helpful just to give everything a quick press with the pins in, as this is going to make it a lot easier to sew at the machine, as everything really stays in place even as you remove those pins. And at the transition of the tie to the facing, just give that a press too. So starting from the point where the tie starts, you want to sew on the inside edge of the facing the whole way around the neckline. You want to take this nice and slow, making sure to backstitch at the start and end of the facing stitching. Then you want to thoroughly press the entire way around the neckline, making sure to use a lot of steam. At the point where the facing ends and the tie begins, you should have a nice clean transition that captures just the edge of that skirt there. And then from there, we're going to sew along the open edge of the tie just to finish that off. And you want to start as close to the dress as you possibly can. Now before you head to the machine, you want to make sure that both ends of your tie are closed, the same as you did with your ties on the bodice. And you just want to sew as close as you can to the open edge of the tie the whole way along. You want to start near the dress as close as you can to where the facing ends, and then you're just going to sew slowly along that open edge, making sure to backstitch at the end to make the tie secure. And you can finish by giving both of your ties a very good press. And you should now have a beautifully finished transition from your facing to your tie, with everything nice and sewn all the way along the edge of the tie. Now our last step is to add elastic to the inside seam of the waistline, and you can choose to do this or not to do this, and you can do it along just the front, or if you want to, you can have it running along the whole way of your dress. It's totally up to you. The third option is to just add the elastic on the top layer of the wrap dress, as that will nip it in and the under layer will already be brought in by the top layer. So to start, you want to measure 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters from where the tie begins, as you don't want this area bunched up. You then want to measure from the side seam to this mark. If you are adding elastic around the entire waistline, you would measure from one mark to the other one. You then want to take that measurement and minus 25%, and you can do this with any online calculator. You simply type in your measurement and minus 25%, and that will give you your elastic length. Of course, if you want to make it smaller, you can minus 30 or 35%. It's up to you what you think looks good. You're then going to pin that elastic from one side seam to the mark that you made. Of course, if you're doing it the whole way along, you would pin it the whole way along. And we're going to be sewing it to the French seam. That way you're not going to see anything on the front of the garment. So starting at the side seam, you're going to pin that in place. And once you've pinned that in place, we're actually going to line up the elastic with the line that you made at the start of your top. And we're going to tack that in place instead of pinning, which is going to make it a lot easier to be able to stretch the elastic at the machine and make sure that pins are not going to slip out while you're sewing. And once you've done tacks in the elastic front side, you want to go back and tack the initial side seam where you had the pin as well. And once both sides are tacked, you then want to pull the elastic to find the middle of the elastic and around the middle of the bodice. And you want to hold that place, and you're also going to give that a tack. This is going to make sure that your elastic is going to sew fairly evenly at the machine. Once you've put a pin in place, you can test to make sure that it's even, and then go ahead and tack that the same way as you did the front and back. Next, we're going to be moving to the machine, and we're going to be sewing one line of straight stitching, and you want the elastic to be pulled as you sew so that it's laying straight across that French seam. Now, because we're stretching the elastic, you can use a straight stitch here, and just go nice and slowly and doing it in sections. You may find that you need to slightly pull the front and back of the elastic as you sew, just to make sure that everything is taut. And once you let it go, you'll find that your elastic nips in the waist. And because you've sewn this while the elastic is going to be stretched as far as it will be, you'll find that your straight stitch works perfectly well, and it's really easy to unpick if you decide that that's not the right elastic for you. And then you just want to come ahead and give everything a good press. This is really going to set all of those new gathers in place that are created by the elastic. And because we can never do too much pressing, you're going to flip to the front side and just give that a nice press and make sure all those gathers are looking super cute. And that's it. You're going to be finished your Sierra Belle.